Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this evening's Authors Series and World Affairs Today program. International intervention in the first part of the 21st century has been characterized by military and economic, as well as unilateral and multilateral intervention. However, the question of when to intervene, if at all, is highly contentious. Humanitarian protection, national security, and national self-determination considerations all pose challenges. From Syria to Nigeria, Iraq, and Ukraine, an international consensus never seems possible. When is intervention justified, and how should it be carried out? To discuss with us this topic is Mr. Michael Doyle, author of The Question of Intervention, Stuart Mill and the Responsibility to Protect. Mr. Doyle not only revisits Stuart Mill's original essay on non-intervention, but the new United Nations doctrine of responsibility to protect. Michael Doyle is the Harold Brown Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, as well as the professor in the law school. In addition, he is director of the Columbia Global Policy Initiative and co-directs the Center on Global Governance. In 2001, Mr. Doyle was appointed Assistant Secretary-General and Special Advisor to the UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan and remained in that role until 2003. He was then appointed as an active member and chairman of the board of the UN Democracy Fund from 2006 to 2013. He has taught at Princeton, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Warwick. This not being his first book, he has also written Ways of War and Peace, Striking First, and co-authored Making War and Building Peace. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Doyle.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fassler, for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here at the World Affairs Council. For more than 100 years, I've read, you've been focused on helping Americans engage with the world. And so my topic this evening, I think, is remarkably appropriate. One of the most controversial, the hardest, the most difficult forms of engagement is intervention, the question of intervention. And that's what I'd like to address this evening. I'd like to imagine that we all share three concerns. The first is a humanitarian commitment to save the lives of people around the world. So a humanitarian principle. Second, we value national self-determination and sovereign government as a good. And third, we understand the importance of national security, especially in a world where no responsible government can cede its national security to an international organization. So I work for the UN, but I don't think it can rule the world. We have to have national self-help. So these are three principles that I ask you to consider sharing. And I don't think it's wild imagining on my part to think that these are widely shared principles. There are certainly ones that I ascribe to. My question in the book, and for these few minutes of discussion with you this evening, is what do these principles mean for what we should think about international intervention? Given those values, how should we judge international intervention? My strategy in the question of intervention, as Stephanie just mentioned, was to go back to the basics. I go back to an essay written by Stuart Mill in 1859. It was an essay called A Few Words on Non-Intervention, which I republish in the back of the book for those who want to read the original. He published it in a small magazine called Fraser's Magazine. And it is the classic location, the locus classicus of the beginning of the debate on the basis of those three values for what we should think about intervention. I comment on his arguments, I defend some, I condemn some, I try to refine others. This is obviously a one-sided debate. He died in 1873. But I have found, going back to his essay, rereading it, it opens up new perspectives, new answers, new questions each time I do so. I do 4 things in the book, and I'd like to comment on them this evening briefly. The first is I start with an interpretation of Mill's few words that focuses on how he addresses 2 puzzles. The first puzzle is non-intervention itself. Given his card-carrying status as a very strong liberal, why not guarantee liberal rights and democracy for all countries? Why not enforce it globally? So the first puzzle is why he rejects that form of intervention. The second puzzle is that given that he's now established the primacy of the principle of non-intervention, that countries should not intervene against each other, why is it that he thinks that one should sometimes override non-intervention and sometimes disregard it? Override it because there are other things that are more important, like national security or humanitarian assistance, or disregard it because the presuppositions about self-determination on which non-intervention rests don't hold in some cases. So 2 kinds of arguments. Third, I'm going to engage a number of his examples, agree with some, disagree with others, revise them. But I'll only touch on a few in my words this evening. The rest are in the book, and I'm hoping that you're tempted to actually go read the book afterwards. And fourth, I want to conclude by bringing this up to date, by looking at a new principle, the principle of responsibility to protect, adopted by the UN General Assembly with US support in 2005, the principle on which the intervention into Libya was justified. And I want to wrap up with some remarks upon Libya. So that's my plan this evening. I should say that I'll be talking about when it's permissible to intervene, not necessarily when it's desirable, because there are a lot of other goals that a country might have, including domestic ones. And some American citizens wonder why we're doing nation building in various places of the world when our own cities could use a bit of city building or nation building at home. There are answers to that question, but that's not my prime concern. My prime concern is when should a country, when it decides it wants to intervene, be allowed to intervene, and when should it not be allowed to intervene? So that's the focus of the argument. Let me start with a couple words on Mill and his philosophic foundations. He shares many of our values and assumptions. He's one of the classic modern political thinkers of our age. He sees all human beings as fundamentally the same, that is, sentient beings that experience pleasure and pain, good and bad. Sympathy, he thinks, should lead us to want to maximize the greatest good pleasures of the greatest number. That's the utilitarian norm, maximizing the pleasures and avoiding the pains for the greatest number of individuals. Unlike some utilitarians, he thinks that pleasures are not all the same. That is, we don't just measure them in a simple poll. Some he thinks are inherently higher. He said that poetry is better than pushpin. None of us have heard of pushpin, but think about it as the 19th century version of Game Boy. So poetry is better than Game Boy for the millions. Politically, there's 2 principles that follow from his utilitarian notion that all human beings should be treated as equals and their pleasures should be maximized, pains avoided. First is maximum equal liberty. Everyone should be as free as possible because they're the best judges of what makes them happy. The only constraint upon that should be the rights of others to pursue their own happiness. So maximum equal liberty is the first principle. The second is representative government, because we can't live in a world of total anarchy. We need to have governmental decisions. And if we have to make governmental decisions, better they reflect the interests, the pleasures of the majority than the minority. Therefore, he prefers a democracy, and representation he thinks works well. This leads me to my first puzzle. One might think with this commitment to liberty and democracy as the best form of government, that it should be enforced across the world. An international version of what's embedded in our Constitution in Article 4, Section 4, which is called the Guarantee Clause. The federal government guarantees to all American states that they will be republics. That is, that they'll be representative governments. And that's guaranteed in the Constitution. You can't create a monarchy in the United States anymore, not after 1787. And of course, after the Civil War amendments guarantees a series of protections for all persons in the country on the basis of equality before the law. So here we have, in the US domestic context, a guarantee of representative democratic government and protections of civil rights within the United States. But Mill thinks that however good liberty and democracy is for many countries, it should not be enforced or guaranteed across borders. It doesn't apply internationally. Their non-intervention is the right principle. And the question is, why does he make that argument? He says that intervention for freedom and democracy, that is imposing by force freedom and democracy, will not be authentic and will not do the objects, that is the people in the foreign country, any real good. And every war, of course, imposes a cost on top of all of that. Let me elaborate. It's not authentic. Liberty, democracy, self-determination can't be imposed. It's not self unless it's self-chosen. And there are many different forms of liberty and democracy, and it's the particular content of them that makes them legitimate. The UK is a democratic, liberal society. The United States is a democratic, liberal society, or we try to be so. In one, there's a monarchy is the head of state, a monarch is the head of state, and a religion is established. Both of those would be radically illegitimate in the domestic American context, but both are free and both are democratic countries. The particular content of self-determination is what gives it its value. So it would not be authentic to impose a form of government, liberty and democracy from abroad. Still, of course, Mill does think that liberal democracy is the best form of government. Abstractly, it's better than despotism. But he then further goes on to say that for consequentialist reasons, that is, the results, we should expect it'll almost always cause more harm than good to try to impose liberal democracy on another society. Because, he says, it's only by arduous struggle, and in the most extreme cases, winning your own democratic revolution, that a people will develop the capacities to exercise and hold on to a government, become attached to it, be willing to follow the laws when properly made, be willing to sacrifice for it, be willing to join police forces or armies, risking their lives for it, be willing to pay taxes for it. It's only by struggling for it that you acquire those capabilities that make it possible actually to rule yourself as a democratic and free people. He says that if instead some foreign, even well-meaning group trying to establish a liberal democracy in another country chooses to do so by force, by intervening militarily to support a group that says that they are in favor of liberty and democracy, there'll be three outcomes. Number one, if you take some liberals out of your knapsack after the intervention, they're unlikely to have sufficient domestic political support to be able to stay in power if they've been set up by a foreign intervention. And instead, as soon as the foreigners leave, boom, another civil war will happen. And so instead of creating a liberal, democratic, nice government, you've created a civil war after all the cost of the military intervention. So that's option one. Option two, he warns, is that, okay, you identify some group that claims to be liberal and democratic, you run up a flag and put them in the Capitol, They then discover that they haven't earned the kind of domestic support that would allow them to stay in power. And what happens? They begin acting just like the previous autocrats, the previous despots. They're no better, okay? So that's outcome 2. Outcome 3 is our interveners show up. They find this good group that ascribes to their principles of liberty and democracy. They look around and see how vulnerable they are, that they're going to collapse, and so the interveners never leave, and what you get is imperialism. So rather than having created freedom and liberty and democracy, you've created a new civil war, an autocracy, or an empire. And so those were Mill's intuitions in 1859, his case for non-intervention. One of my graduate students, Camille Strauss-Kahn, and I decided to test some of Mill's intuitions. Let's look at the record. And so we examined the historical record of interventions from 1859 till today. That is, armed interventions across borders coming between a government and its people. Overt, we didn't look at covert interventions. We found 334 of them that qualify for that, and they're all listed in the appendix in the back of the book. 221 of them were militarily successful. That is, they weren't repulsed by the country that was intervened against. Of that 221, 56 led to a new civil war soon after the intervention. 68 produced a new autocracy rather than a liberal democracy. 146 resulted in an empire. Only 26 produced a free, independent, more rights-respecting, participatory government than before. By the way, for the math whizzes who just added that up, it adds up to more than 221, and that's because some very unfortunate countries had more than one of those harms inflicted upon it. But that's the distribution. There's only a 12% success rate by this minimal definition of success. Not very good. Mill's intuitions are not bad. Now, for social scientists in the room, you will push back, and I'd be happy to address your questions. What are the controls? What difference does it make if they're well-meaning or poorly meaning interventions? In point of fact, the vast majority of interventions have mixed motivations. They think of good reasons, but there are also other things that are at work. I can address those problems of the complication. But I think we can still infer from this a couple points. Number one, Mill's intuitions, I think, are affirmed. That is, we get some support for them. It means that interventions are dangerous to your national security. Many of them fail, as I mentioned. It's also harmful for the country intervened against. It rarely enhances self-determination, and it typically produces more civil wars or renewed autocracy or empire. So as a minimum, the burden of proof has to be on the intervener, that this intervention is likely in these particular circumstances to do some good. The burden of proof, because the record is that most of them produce harm rather than good. And if there is an intervention, the intervener has a distinct moral responsibility to try to avoid the very likely bad outcomes that typically come with intervention: new civil wars, renewed autocracy, imperial manipulation. That brings me to the second puzzle, and these I'll go through a bit more quickly. The world is complicated, okay? It's complicated in two ways. There are some factors that produce exceptions. Sometimes, despite the strength of the Millian argument against intervention, we will want to override it for the sake of national security of the intervening country, or humanitarian assistance in some extreme circumstances for a population being so victimized, like by a genocide, that it's intolerable to just stand and watch. And there'll be other circumstances, Mill argues, that the non-intervention norm should be disregarded because the assumptions on which it's based don't hold in a particular case. Now, I should mention that Mill very quickly rejects all sorts of ordinary interventions to increase power, territory, and revenue. He doesn't think those are even worth considering if you're thinking about when you should intervene. Those are all corrupt motives. So he's interested in the normative. When should you do it? And he's going to make a case that there are a few exceptions. Let me briefly mention some where he thinks it should be disregarded. That is, the assumptions about how self-determination works don't hold in these circumstances, and therefore one can disregard the norm of not intervening. I'll mention just a few, there are many in the book. One is that under circumstances of national liberation, or the secession of one nation being dominated by another, the idea that you should wait for an arduous struggle while the small minority nation struggles to define itself is unrealistic and could be distinctly unfair. If it's a small minority but very strong demand for national self-determination inside a huge nation, no amount of local struggling is going to be able to decide the matter. And under those circumstances, Mill argues, once that nation has proved its authentic nationhood and established a number of other benchmarks of responsibility, it would be legitimate to assist its independence. Mill makes a reference to the Americans in 1776, despite the fact his country was on the wrong side of that one, you'll recall. But in his own times, he talks about the separation of Belgium from Holland, where the British and the French intervened diplomatically and with a few troops on the ground to help the Belgians become independent from the Netherlands in 1830. He thinks the Hungarians should have been assisted to become separate from the Austrians in 1848. That would have been a reasonable thing to do. In our own time, of course, we've had secessions that many regard as legitimate, of Eritrea from Ethiopia, the breakup of the former Soviet Union, former Yugoslavia, separation of East Timor from Indonesia, and then very controversial ones like the breakup of Georgia with South Ossetia, broken away from Georgia with Russian intervention. The Sudan, the South Sudan from the rest of Sudan, and unfortunately many, many happening as well. The question is, how do you identify a people? It's not easy. There's no quick recipe for that. What really is a people? What is the majority? What are its wishes? How to prioritize peaceful forms of self-administration, and if necessary, velvet divorces like Czechoslovakia broke into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, rather than the violent ones. We need to develop tools for that. I mentioned some that have been developed in that direction. Issues about compensation. What if the rich want to secede from the poor? Is that legitimate? A major issue, needless to say. And I address them there. I'd be happy to come back to them. Sometimes as well, there are counter-interventions. That is, if one country is already intervening in a civil war, you shouldn't let that intervention decide the fair struggle for who should rule. It might be legitimate to counter-intervene so that you balance the prior intervention and that the real struggle then takes place between the domestic partners struggling to define what kind of countries that they should have. It's an interesting argument. The problem with Mill's argument there is that, of course, you may just be creating a more long-term, protracted civil war if each side is feeding the partners, and that can have enormously bad effects. I'm going to skip over Mill's most notorious disregard. I'm happy to lay into Mill on this one here, but he provides a justification for benign imperialism for some countries in Africa and Asia that he didn't think were capable of ruling themselves or cooperating through international law. He thinks they need paternalistic government. It's extremely weak argument, and I'd be happy to, as I say, jump on him a little bit if you're interested. And that's a chapter in the book on imperialism, which I'd recommend too. Let me then turn to the overrides. I've been talking about disregards, where the assumptions of self-determination that allow countries to relate to each other don't hold, where national self-determination doesn't work. One big nation is crushing a little one. You can't let a struggle determine the result. Now I'm moving to overrides, where other considerations override the norm of non-intervention. And the two major overrides are the national security of the intervening country and the humanitarian interest of the intervened can sometimes require an intervention. Your own national security counts. In some circumstances, you may need to intervene to rescue your citizens who are being held hostage. Mill talks about a couple cases, very obscure ones, But in our own time, think of the Israeli raid in Uganda at Entebbe to get their citizens who had been held hostage by the government of Idi Amin. Not much else could have been done. The outcome was otherwise just to leave them there. So national security under extreme circumstances can justify crossing a border with your military forces to protect your own nations or your vital national security. And Mill has some interesting things to talk about there, which I'd be happy to elaborate if you're interested. A second override is following a just defensive war. You've been attacked, okay? It doesn't mean you've got to stop at the border when you push back the aggressor. If you assume that the aggressor has deeply embedded aggressive instincts and constitutes what Mill calls a standing menace to the peace, you're allowed to keep going across the border so that you can make sure that whatever was producing the aggression in the past is stopped, okay? Mill has in mind Napoleon. He's writing in 1859. They stopped once in 1849, put him on a nice little island right off of Italy. 6 months later, he's back doing the whole thing all over again. They had to fight another international war. So eventually they pack him all the way back to St. Helena, way down the South Atlantic, and they assist the Bourbons, no credible crew, to come back and rule in a more stable fashion in France. In our own time, of course, we think of things such as in post-World War II period, the denazification of Germany. The Allies did not stop at the Rhine. They kept going and then helped the Germans stage what was in effect a democratic revolution within Germany. Something similar in Japan. After the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, one didn't cross the border, but a regime was imposed upon him to try to ensure that he would become disarmed and less dangerous. Not very successful, but this was imposed as a form of intervention on Saddam Hussein. The hard question, of course, is how many lives is it worth to effect that kind of a revolution? Very, very difficult question. Let me come to my last point here, most relevant today, which is humanitarian intervention. One doesn't want to intervene for all the good reasons that Mill describes, but in some circumstances, the level of casualties being experienced in a country in the midst, let's say, of a civil war or other forms of oppression is so severe, a genocide is so appalling, the numbers keep adding up year after year that common human sympathy says something needs to be done to stop the slaughter, and that the border is less important than saving the lives. For Mill, he is a very interesting example of that. In 1846, the British intervened in Portugal. It was a minor intervention, but they intervened to help a civil war between the monarch and the progressives, the Democrats, and they helped settle it with coercive force. And lo and behold, Mill mentions it was a very successful intervention. After that, there were 2-3 generations of peace in Portugal, began to get its act together, and began industrialization. So it had a good result, even if it was an intervention. That was his example. We need to be a little careful about that because a lot of the good results came not from the intervention, but from good luck. That is, there was a new king, a guy named Pedro, he was the one who actually did all the reforms that were necessary to make that new peaceful arrangement between the monarchy and the Democrats last for a while in Portugal. And so we have to be very careful about the aftermath of an intervention. We can't just assume that it happens. There needs to be active peace-building strategies that bring a country back together. And again, I'd be happy to elaborate. I talk about that in the book. The bigger point I want to make is that humanitarian interventions sound good, but time and time again they get exploited. That is, a humanitarian motive is put forward, and instead you get an imperial conquest. How does one have genuine humanitarian interventions rather than using humanitarianism as an excuse for imperialism? And here is where I want to wrap up with our contemporary case of the responsibility to protect, R2P. This is the current answer to that question of when a justified humanitarian intervention could take place. This is a doctrine adopted by the UN in 2005, unanimously, In the U.S. context, it has bipartisan support. That is, the Bush administration in 2005 endorsed the doctrine. And of course, it was used in 2011 by NATO and the Obama administration as the justification for the intervention in Libya. So it has deep support, that's wrong, wide, but maybe thin support in the United States. So what is this doctrine? This was a statement, again, adopted unanimously at the UN General Assembly, all countries, there was no dissent. It has 3 pillars. It declares, first of all, that every country has a responsibility to protect its own people from war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. No country should do that. Every country acknowledges its responsibility to protect its own citizens. Second of all, the international community, through the UN, accepts a responsibility to assist countries at their request to do this. So an assistance norm, that's the second pillar. And the third pillar is that if a country fails to prevent these harms to their own citizens, fails to protect their own citizens, the international community says it will step in through the Security Council to do so. That's the radical striking part. It says that if war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide are taking place, the international community will stop it. That's the radical part of that doctrine. It's a revolutionary international commitment. The first part, the countries shouldn't do that to their own people, that's not new, that's standard international law. But the idea that the international community, through the UN, through the Security Council, will enforce that, that was a new statement. It doesn't change international law, but it's a powerful, unanimous norm that was set forward in order to create a new standard of international and national behavior. So it was quite significant. It's both a license and a leash. If there are lawyers in the room, it builds upon the discretion that's already embedded in the UN Charter given to the Security Council to determine threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, acts of aggression. It has that authority already in Chapter 7. What this new norm does is it says, even though it says international threats in the Charter, it's a directive from the General Assembly as a whole to interpret international broadly to include what might otherwise seem as domestic crimes, war crimes committed inside a civil war, or crimes against humanity, slaughters, things such as that, or genocide, or ethnic cleansing. So it changes the interpretation of international in Article 39 of the UN Charter. The second thing is it's not just a license, it's also a leash. It's saying that all of the other reasons that have been put on the table for interventions are not legitimate. Whether you want to promote democracy, like in Haiti in 1994, or whatever goals you might have, they're not legitimate grounds for armed intervention. Only these 4 are. War crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. Those are the ones that should be stopped. Not for other goals should there be intervention. So it's a license and a leash. And it furthermore says that this authorization has to come from the Security Council. It's not something you can choose for yourself. So that's the new doctrine. That brings us to Libya. Here we see it was technically the third, but it was the first major armed implementation of this new doctrine. In Security Council Resolution 1973 of March 17, 2001, the Security Council authorized member states to take all necessary means to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas within Libya. This was a legal authorization of what then became a legal military intervention into Libya. The justifications of it were familiar. President Obama put on the table the threat to regional stability in Libya, extreme violence that was being experienced by the Libyan people, and Gaddafi's forces were almost indiscriminate in their attacks upon the Libyan population that was resisting them. And thirdly, the threat of more to come. That is, he talked about Benghazi and the danger of overrunning Benghazi as Gaddafi's forces moved east across the country, and in the president's words, one could not wait one more day. So the Security Council authorized this military force. There were no vetoes. Russia did not veto, China did not veto. There were abstentions, however. Brazil, China, Germany, India, and Russia all abstained, but they did not veto, so it legally passed. Many hoped for an immaculate intervention. That is, this would be authorized, and then Gaddafi would wake up, there'd be authorized military force, and negotiate a deal with the rebels that would put the country back on a course. Gaddafi was not interested in negotiating, neither were the rebels. And so Susan Rice warned the Security Council, okay, we will intervene with air forces, not troops on the ground, with air forces, but we're going to have to do a widespread campaign, she said. It's not just going to be pinpoint. Fine, so they were warned about that. What happened, on the other hand, is that a stalemate began to emerge. And then the NATO forces and some of their strong supporters from the Gulf, like Qatar and others, came to the view that this just had to be ended. And so they went beyond, in my opinion, the legal terms of the mandate they had been given by the Security Council resolution and decided to become the rebels' tactical air force. And that's what the NATO planes became in the last month or so of the war, and then proceeded to defeat Gaddafi's forces. Gaddafi's forces were horribly brutal in the treatment of the population. The vast majority of the Libyan population was supporting the overthrow of Gaddafi. They didn't want him. But nonetheless, there was excess action taken by NATO that was not authorized by the Security Council. And as a result, there's been some political pushback. The doctrine of R2P was wounded by the Libyan outcome. There are charges of ultra vires, going beyond the terms that were legally organized. And of course, there's been a lot of criticism, not just by Russians and Chinese, but South Africans, Brazilians, and others. So let me wrap up with the last lesson here. And we can see, I should mention, the results of this in Syria, where even more harms are being inflicted on the population there in orders of magnitude larger than the harms in Libya. And there is no effective international pressure on Assad's government. There are no carrots and sticks in the mediation that my former boss, Kofi Annan, led, none whatsoever. And at the same time, there's a whole arms are pouring in from Russia, from Iran, from others. And we now are beginning to tilt in favor of the other side, providing arms for moderates if we can ever find them. And on top of all that has arisen this truly horrendous, murderous group, ISIS, which has taken over about half the country, and they're worse than Assad. So a complete mess. And the tool of R2P is not available. It's not available right now. And so we have an incoherent international response to the conflict there. And if at the very beginning a coherent response had been taken, there might have been an ability to pressure Assad into negotiations and pressure the rebels into negotiations. Not impossible. Right now, we're in a horrible mess. Let me wrap up and conclude. R2P is a large step forward. As you can hear, I'm a fan of R2P. I think it was a major doctrinal achievement for the international community, a step forward in global governance. But it has three major difficulties right now. We still don't have a clear understanding of when to invoke it and how to think strategically about when to use it. There is no shared understanding of that within the UN today, producing a lot of disputes. We don't have a good way to manage it. That is, we don't have a good way to provide accountability from the Security Council to whoever is implementing it. NATO's operation was a bit of a blank check. They did not stay in touch with the Security Council. And we haven't developed good doctrines on how to assist countries that have been assisted through R2P to put themselves back together, legitimate peace building. Three big challenges ahead that people are now working on. So I wrap up by saying, Mill, for me, is an intellectual resource, and I hope that those who read the book or have read Mill would come to some of that similar appreciation. And he provides very powerful reasons not to intervene, and he opens a door for thinking about when to override, when to disregard, even though some of his examples, as I've mentioned, are totally implausible. But he does open the door to that. But most importantly, I think we can learn from him to keep that strong presumption against intervention, which Mill brilliantly argued for. That is, never regard that as an easy first option, which should be major burdens of proof on anyone who wants to advocate for intervention. And don't intervene, this is the million lesson, unless there are very strong reasons to overrule or disregard. And today one should try to go through multilateral procedures like R2P, if that's the case, wherever possible. And second of all, if one does intervene, one needs to make sure that a self-sustaining peace is the result of it, rather than another civil war, renewed autocracy, or imperial control. And for that, one needs to pay equal attention to, after the intervention, as the intervention, one needs strategies of peace building that are concerted and viable. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be delighted to take any comments or questions that you might have.
Thank you for the talk there. But doesn't R2P have a more fundamental flaw built in that was not discussed? If you have a context in which a nation has a minority that does two things. One, grows very fast demographically and refuses to recognize the legitimacy of the government in place. There are many places around the world I could name where this process is actually going on right now and has happened over time. Then should not that nation state have the right to defend itself against an enemy that is absolutely, totally, absolutely wants to destroy it? Definitely. And in that case, it's just obviously, and then based on that and the fact that in the case of Libya, it was obvious that basically, Senator McCain and all these people were dancing with Islamic terrorists. It was obvious to me that it didn't even have a chance to succeed in the first place, and that's why it failed so miserably.
On your first point, given the scenario that you described, R2P prescribes assistance to the government if they're dealing with a violent minority using illegitimate means, including war crimes or crimes against humanity, in rebellion against the government. Then the right response is the international community has an obligation to assist that government to maintain law and order using reasonable means to do so.
May I make one? Sorry. I apologize for not having stated that. But typically the way R2P ends up happening is that it basically no longer maintains the territorial integrity of the nation state in question, as has happened in the Balkans, for example. That's typically what I see happening. I mean, yeah, in theory, you could negotiate with, say, a Muslim enclave that basically is growing and and seeks to destabilize the non-Islamic regime in place. And of course, the dynamics are intractable, as they say all over the world.
Just as a last comment, yes, indeed, the implementation, the application is full of immense complexities, and we know that we often get them wrong. But the doctrine suggests that the right response to that scenario is to assist the government to maintain its national sovereignty, national integrity, and do so in ways that respect the rules of warfare as it, in your scenario, defeats the group that you're describing that is engaged in those illegitimate means. Now, whether we see that happening or not, we can't be sure. Some of the uses of the doctrine have been very quiet. In Kenya, for example, in 2008, Kofi Annan, again my former boss, went there to help mediate after electoral violence took place. And he never had to invoke the R2P doctrine, but he knew that they knew that it was on the table, and other African states were saying that unless the government dealt with the electoral violence that occurred, it might be invoked against them. And so it was a useful diplomatic tool to do what you described, that is, to constrain forces that were prepared to use violence and mayhem against their own population to break up a country. And this helped to keep Kenya together. And they had a recent election that was quite successful. All their politicians are not great, but they've been given a new lease on life. They've been given temporary immunity from prosecution, because some people were alleging that they too should be prosecuted. But still, this was a state-building effort that was pretty justifiable, I think. Yes, please.
What's your opinion on covert operations as a form of intervention?
As I mentioned, we don't talk about covert operations, or when Camille and I put together this long list, nor do we have a good record of them. a good covert operation you and I never hear about. That is a good one, a successful one. The failures we sometimes do. And I think that we should apply at least the same standards. That is, that there should not be covert operations any more than there should be overt operations. The moral rules against intervention should apply to them in the same way. Now, typically, they involve fewer casualties, and they're deniable, so they're attractive to governments and used, and fewer casualties. But nonetheless, they're often attached to significant numbers of casualties with huge negative consequences. If we think about, just in the U.S. case, our operations in Guatemala in 1954 had severe negative effects on the government of Guatemala for many, many years thereafter. So we should apply the same standards to them and not do them. The difficulty from the standpoint of just purely the academic is that we don't have a good record of how many there have been, so they're harder to assess in that way. Yes, please.
My name is Samar Chatterjee. Thank you for writing a book. Now, you didn't, I have lots of different questions, but if you could give us a little explanation of R2P, what it is, because my friend here wants to know, and I think I do. But my question is, why did you skip any mention of Vietnam? Because I come from a country which is called India, where we thought that the defeat of the United States in Vietnam should teach a lesson, because U.S. was among the two superpowers, the biggest bully in the world, and therefore it might help end these military interventions, frivolous military interventions, both by United States and Soviet Union. However, Soviet Union collapsed finally, so that's safe. But United States still represents a big threat to world peace, because it willy-nilly, frivolously, with lies and fabrications, intervenes militarily, which has happened, even in Libya it has happened. So given that, you've not analyzed that, and why didn't you do that?
You'll find a brief discussion of the Vietnamese intervention, the U.S. intervention in Vietnam in the book. That's been extensively documented by American and other scholars. The fact that it had extremely severe consequences on the Vietnamese and on the American, particularly the American military, is well known. And in the end, of course, it produced the government that one could have had back in 1954, 55. So not ideal from the standpoint of liberalism or democracy, but certainly authentic. That is definitely Vietnamese, and one that right now there is no grounds for anyone outside of Vietnam to want to interfere with. The Vietnamese may have their own views on the question. So I don't talk about it, but very briefly in the book. It's been talked about extensively as a failed intervention. The Soviets, of course, had their own in Afghanistan, very similar. It helped to bring down the Soviet Union, one of the things that bankrupted the country. We recovered from that. But we haven't recovered from interventions, some of which I think are unwise.
We're back again.
Others, I think, are wise. As you may have picked up, I think the right decision was made by the Security Council in Libya, that to have left the Libyan people to Gaddafi would have produced, I think the president was right, a horrendous massacre. Not unlike the kind of massacres that took place in the Balkans and in Rwanda and elsewhere. Now, it wasn't genocidal in intent, but the chances, I think, were quite significant. And so, in my view, the Security Council, with the U.S. and the other states supporting it, made the right decision. Now, that's not to say that it was well managed. It was not well managed. And that's not to say that they didn't go beyond the terms of what was authorized, because they did go beyond the terms of what was authorized.
Would you explain this R2P?
Yes. Back to R2P, it's just the idea is responsibility to protect. And as I mentioned, it has those three parts to it. The first responsibility is of a government to protect its own people from a series of crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing. That's the first responsibility. Every country has the responsibility to its own people to protect them from those crimes. That is not to inflict them, And if some rebel group is attempting to afflict them, to defeat them, to protect their own people. The second thing is that the international community agreed to assist governments in fulfilling their mandate. It could be foreign aid, could be advice, could be diplomatic support. There is a responsibility to help a government to protect its own people. And if that fails, if the government is unable to protect its people or unwilling to protect its people, then the residual responsibility is on the Security Council to step in and do so. And that was a particular case in Libya.
Thanks. So with respect to the R2P doctrine, you've talked about it both as a right to protect and a responsibility to protect. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about to what extent it's an obligation to protect and sort of what the intent was there and what the understanding is, and a little more about how that would work.
Yes. I don't know, you're a law student or a lawyer? Okay, well, there's a huge debate on parsing exactly how this operates. The UN Charter in Chapter 7 gives the Security Council the responsibility to protect, to prevent, stop, punish breaches of the peace, acts of aggression. It can engage in preventive warfare, authorize force, but this is all for international threats to the peace. That's in Article 39 of the UN Charter. And this discretion is very broad. There's been no restraint that's been imposed upon it. There was a case, the earlier Libya case, the Libya Lockerbie incident from back in the 80s, was a case that went to the International Court of Justice. And the court affirmed the discretion of the Security Council to define what international means. Okay, so very broad discretion. What happens with R2P is that many states within the UN were angry at how wide that discretion was, that it was used for all sorts of things in the 1990s, that some countries found implausible and illegitimate. And therefore, the General Assembly then turned around in the summer of 2005 and said, we want you to regard these crimes that occurred domestically in countries as ones that are part of your mandate, but nothing else. We want you to stop war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. But we don't want you to think that you can intervene in countries to improve their health care, to promote democracy, to promote human rights in general, freedom of press, all of which are fine, but none of which are sufficiently vital and important in order to justify the use of force. But force should be justified to stop war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. So this was a message that was sent by the General Assembly. Now that resolution is not law, it's only a recommendation. The law is in the charter itself, and to change the charter you need a new treaty, you need to revise the UN Charter. None of that has been done. So there's still critics out there in the legal community who say that R2P is a step beyond the tight reading of what the law says. But the majority think that international is sufficiently broad that how it's interpreted is within the discretion of the Security Council. The Security Council is now being told by the General Assembly, interpret it this way, and we'll back you up. I think that's the essence of what's going on in R2P.
Is it possible to assist in a peaceful or not peaceful intervention in the formation or restoration of a different form of government drastically, like a drastic different?
Is it possible to intervene peaceably and do that legitimately and legally? Is that what you're posing to me?
I'm referring more to, I feel that a lot of times when there's like interventions, peaceful or not, they somehow impose a form of government that might have not existed there beforehand, or that just simply doesn't work. Because, an example, in Mexico, when the conquest or the Spaniards arrived, there was a different form of society. And a lot of authors, like Octavio Paz, say that if socialism, for example, were to be established from the very beginning, it would have probably worked better than the republic, like democratic republic that we have in Mexico, because the form that the people were, like their culture in general. So my question is, like, can there be an intervention without imposing your form of government?
That's a good question. So the way I would translate that a little bit to say is, if you have an intervention that you have to do to stop horrible slaughter that take place, let us say, a genocide, what then should you do so that the country can rule itself afterwards in an authentic way that reflects the local culture? That's one way of operationalizing, I think, what you're asking. And because normally one shouldn't intervene. You should let people run their own country, right? But if you do have to intervene to stop a genocide or massive slaughters that are otherwise going to occur, you have intervened now. What should you do to avoid imposing an inauthentic government within a country? Because if you do that, then you get civil wars and new autocracy or empire. So how do you avoid that? And that's the challenge of peace building, legitimate peace building. And there's very few things more difficult than to think about how to do that. Now, the UN has some experience in El Salvador. There was a peace operation there, another in Cambodia. They've had operations in Mozambique. Some of these are successful. In Namibia, all of these semi-successful. So how did you get the successful ones? And a lot of failures, like Somalia, Bosnia for 2 or 3 times, and we could think of many, Angola many times. So how do you get the success? And I think the first lesson that comes out of this is that you can't design it elsewhere. A peace has to be designed locally. So the only time that you will get a successful peace is if the locals decide to write a new constitution that they will be prepared to live under. So the first thing is a peace treaty. Even if you've intervened to stop a genocide or massacres, you've got to roll back that and say everybody has an opportunity to participate, should have an opportunity to participate in redesigning the country. So you need a constitutional effort. Once that's done, with adequate international assistance and sufficient time, you can sometimes get a lasting peace because the locals will have designed it and they've been assisted with, foreign aid and a variety of other measures that they can reconstruct a government that they themselves want. And in some regards, what's happened in the successful cases looks a bit like that, far from perfect. The UN has a 50% success rate, 50% failure rate. But in the 50% successes, they were all started by a genuine effort to bring all the parties together in order to design a future way that they'd live together. And then they provided peacekeepers, civilian and military, to assist in that transition, sometimes reforming the police, sometimes the court system, to create a government that is viable. And so it's sometimes done, but again, 50% success rate. That's not too bad. Hitting 500 in baseball is not too bad. But in other fields of endeavor, 50% means there's still a lot of good work that needs to be done. Thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.